You're listening to EdTech Heroes, a podcast that looks at how teachers in today's classrooms can use technology to improve student learning. In each episode, a hero in the world of education will share their story and discuss how innovation can influence the minds of the next generation. Let's jump in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to EdTech Heroes. I'm Nef, and today's guest is Kareem Farah of Modern Classrooms Project. Before co-founding Modern Classrooms Project, Kareem spent 6 years teaching in schools that support students with a high diversity of academic and social emotional needs in both Hawaii and DC. In 2018, Kareem was awarded the Standing Ovation Award for Excellence in Classroom Innovation for his blended, self-paced, mastery-based approach to teaching and learning, which has become more important than ever for educators. I'd like to officially welcome our first EdTech Heroes guest, Kareem Farah. Thanks for joining, Kareem.
Thanks, Nef. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So first question, and it's a burning one. When they award you the Standing Ovation Award, do they in fact all stand up?
In retrospect, I think they actually did. They came to my class and surprised me. It was award in DC Public Schools for innovation. And actually, the coolest part was they built a little video about my classroom that they then played at an award ceremony. And that's actually what sprung the idea that we should create a nonprofit, was this video that ended up kind of inspiring demand and excitement from educators and realizing that the model that I had created with my co-founder in my classroom was worth sharing.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit about that. I mentioned the Modern Classrooms Project in the introduction, and it sounds like the award that you won was kind of the impetus for this awesome project. So tell us a little bit more about the project and what you guys do.
Yeah, so I'll start with just the model itself. I was an educator in DC Public Schools at the time. I was going into my 4th year teaching when I really realized that one-size-fits-all approaches to teaching and learning are just ineffective and uniquely ineffective when you're serving a high diversity of learning levels and social emotional needs. Where I was teaching, my students were certainly facing unique challenges that made it difficult to access a traditional classroom. And I realized that when I was standing at the front of the room and delivering lectures at a class that maybe had 40% attendance on a given day, students' needs were just very diverse, many students experiencing trauma. It just wasn't working. So I started with the idea that lectures needed to be eliminated. Like that was the first deeply inequitable element of my learning design. And that's what inspired the creation of instructional videos. I realized look, the easiest way to get around this is I just build my own instructional videos. When I do that, students will be able to access the content anytime, anywhere. And I am no longer consumed with delivering a live performance at the front of the room. That's just isn't that effective. From there, we realized, my co-founder and I, that when you replace your lectures with instructional videos that you create, you can now let kids be at different spots in a unit. So instead of assuming that every kid has to be doing the exact same thing every minute of class, that's no longer necessary because the lecture is what actually require that. So then we let kids work at their own pace. And then finally, when you actually let kids work at their own pace, you can grade them on mastery. And that was the most exciting next phase because now kids don't transition from one lesson to the next because of a different day of the week, but instead because they've actually understood the previous skill. So that's the model itself. That's the model I won the award for. The nonprofit, simply put, empowers educators with the model. So we have a free course and a virtual mentorship program. And our vision is just to empower as many educators across the country and the world with this instructional approach, assuming that they want to implement it.
Sure. And as a former educator myself, one of the things that seems scary about the approach is, when is there synchronous instruction? How do we get students to start to work collaboratively? And how do I manage students who might presumably be on all different parts of a lesson? So will you talk a little bit about how you blend both asynchronous instruction and synchronous instruction as part of the model that you guys are spreading?
Yeah, so I think there's generally just a misconception around how synchronous instruction is supposed to work in a classroom. To start, I think the biggest misconception is, why does every single kid in the room need to be traveling through the same synchronous experience? So I can have synchronous instruction through a small group of 5 to 7 kids at any given time. That's just as effective, I would argue significantly more effective than trying to do that synchronous lesson with 25 kids at a time. And that's certainly even more effective when it's based off of need. So I'm not dragging a kid into a synchronous lesson that they don't actually need because they understood the skill. I'm focusing on the students who actually require it. So in our classrooms, teachers leverage synchronous instruction largely through small group and individualized instruction, and is generally done on a needs basis. In addition to that, all of our educators are facilitating live discussions. Those discussions, though, are about bringing kids together and actually communicating through a back and forth and through sharing of ideas. They're not used to say, hey, everyone sit down, I'll talk at you. You answer some sort of question that I ask you, but not all of you are going to answer it, usually just one or two, and you're going to take notes. That's not like true learning, right? That's just delivery of information. And the beauty of technology is we've eliminated the need to use systems that are that inefficient. And then sort of from a collaborative perspective, I actually got really frustrated as an educator how often I was being told to make my students collaborate. And the reason I grew frustrated is because when I forced collaboration on kids without a purpose, it was meaningless class time. It was just like telling kids to do a think, pair, share for no reason. It wasn't helping them learn. They were just doing it. So I could say to someone who's observing me or to myself, I made my kids do a think, pair, share 3 times in today's lesson. In this model, what you're actually leveraging is this idea that some kids are at different spots, which warrant collaboration. If I'm on lesson 3 and another kid's on lesson 4, well, now I should probably go ask the kid on lesson 4 for help on lesson 3 if I'm stuck, right? So it creates this data-driven rationale behind why kids should actually be leveraging their peers. Or, hey, I'm going to work with this student because we're on the same lesson and we're struggling with the same problem, and I'd love a thought partner on that. So really thinking kind of tactfully about what the purpose of collaboration is and how it can be leveraged effectively is one of the key elements of what we do in our model. And, folks learn our model through both a free course and a virtual mentorship program. We have an entire section devoted just to collaboration in a self-paced setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like in this model, a lot of the onus is on the student to pace themselves, to prove mastery, to seek out peers who might be effective collaborators. How do educators start to get their students to think in the basis of really owning their learning?
Yeah, this is an interesting concept because if you go into a very, very young classroom, like a classroom that's supporting students that are kindergarten, preschool, it's not something you need to teach a student to actually own their own learning. Like kids inherently are going to drive their own learning. It's logical to be in the driver's seat. I actually think we condition kids out of it. We tell them instead of going and exploring and building and problem solving, sit in your seat and wait for me to give you your next step. So what I tell folks is just believe that the kids can do it and give them the structures to be able to access learning at any time. A lot of times people are anxious to roll out our model because of this very question. Like, what if my kids can't control their own learning? What if my kids aren't developmentally ready, which is one of the most common lines I hear that drives me a little bit nuts, to be able in the driver's seat. And that stuff is kind of all nonsense. And I think it's generally educators being a little bit worried about releasing control. And I will be the first to say I was petrified of this. If you told me in my second year teaching to roll a model out like this, I would have said there's no chance. I got to be at the front of the room. I got to be the guy that leads everything and does the performance. But once you start to just say, hey, kids, here are all the steps. Here's all the resources. Here are the end goals. Go. You will be shocked with how consistently kids are able to drive their own learning. They don't actually need you to learn information. They need you to intervene when they're struggling. They need you to intervene when they're stuck. But if you build out the right processes, if you create effective instructional videos, if you leverage a learning management system effectively, suddenly you realize that kids are quite intuitive and they're able to drive their own learning very comfortably.
So I'm curious a little bit about how the Modern Classrooms project survived COVID-19. What was it like to deploy your model in a remote learning framework?
Yeah, so ultimately our model is an in-person model because we think the highest form of classroom instruction and learning happens in the in-person setting. What we knew when COVID broke was that folks were kind of in an emergency way, trying to transition to the virtual world and hybrid world. And they needed some sort of framework and structure to handle that. And simultaneously, we already had implementers in the field. We already had educators across the country doing our model, and they were texting us and calling us and emailing us and saying, hey, we're fine, but our teachers are panicking. Our colleagues who don't know the model don't know what to do next. But we were able to transition to the virtual and remote space comfortably because our kids can self-pace. They can drive their own learning. We use our learning management system effectively. We have instructional videos. So we realized that our model created a clear blueprint for educators who are trying to figure out remote and hybrid instruction. And while it wasn't, the highest form of teaching and learning, in my opinion, it did stomach the blows of the transition quite well. So educators flocked to our work. We had 28,000 teachers join our free course over the last, 18 months or so, and really used it as an example for how they can think about teaching and learning in the virtual space. In addition to that, we obviously created guidance. So we leaned on our educators who were making this transition to provide us with the tools, the tips, the resources that we thought were most effective to share out with the general public. So, when you look at our course materials, you actually see in purple us highlighting all the different points in time where you can think about the remote and hybrid application of our model.
Got it. And as the majority of teachers start to transition back to in person, or perhaps already transitioned last school year, they are in a place where they created instructional videos out of necessity. What do you have to say for teachers who are ready to throw that away and transition back to a largely synchronous, non mastery based approach to teaching? What can we learn from COVID-19 and get us closer to the model that you guys are talking about, and ultimately get us closer to allowing students to actually master the concepts?
Yeah, COVID exposed what was really ineffective about our traditional teaching and learning. So when you go into the virtual space and you sit through a live lecture over Zoom, you realize just how ineffective live lectures are, right? It's amazingly boring. And I think one of the most jarring things that a lot of educators experience is kids who would turn their screens off and they wouldn't show their faces and they wouldn't really engage. And suddenly you realize, I'm just talking into a vacuum. So I think what folks should recognize and leverage is the fact that those realities are true in the in-person setting. It's just a little bit harder to hide behind a screen. So a kid might be staring forward but not listening, or their heads are down and disengaged. So don't throw away the elements of instruction that you learned in the COVID kind of hybrid remote world. Pull the parts that are most powerful. So to start, why lecture? Leverage technology to use your time more efficiently. You should be spending your time in small group and individualized instruction, truly differentiating to students' needs. Additionally, why hold kids back from information? Right? One of the most inequitable things we can do is say that the only way to access content is when I say it out of my mouth live. What happens when a kid's experiencing trauma? What happens when a kid's absent? What happens when a kid just can't follow along at the moment and would like you to just stop or slow down? Right? All these things are just realities of a student's experience in the classroom, and it's been the case for years, but we just kind of go with the flow because it's convenient. COVID's empowered us to think a little bit differently about how technology is leveraged and then infused in the classroom. And the last piece I'd say is COVID exposed the importance of self-paced learning. It was called asynchronous learning during COVID. But ultimately, the core idea is that kids don't learn things at the exact same pace as their peers. And if we have that expectation, you're going to see an irrational kind of grading system and a set of results. It just doesn't make any sense that you tell a kid to start a lesson, they're sitting next to their peer, one kid gets through it comfortably, the other kid doesn't, but you both just have to go on to the next lesson the next day. What ends up happening is one kid starts to hate school and doesn't believe in themselves, and the other kid seems to be somewhat bored or comfortable with the speed of the content. That's not okay. That's not how you push kids. That's not how you ensure that they're reaching their full potential. So I think COVID most of all taught us that, hey, we should be leveraging technology to give kids access to content anytime, anywhere, because that's equitable. And B, we need to think a whole lot more about the importance of self-paced learning and giving some kids more time and some kids less time on particular skills and lessons.
Sure. And that makes a ton of sense. And I love that you started to create this connection between the way in which we teach as educators and the feelings that our students have about school more broadly. And I think that obviously we come to work to teach standards, but we also want to foster a love of learning. And how might we be able to do that? I know that there is somebody listening who is saying, Kareem, this sounds awesome, but I have one laptop to my name, or I have a cart that I have to sign out and compete with other educators to be able to use. So how might someone who has limited access to technology be able to deploy a model like yours? Or what do you have to say about that particular struggle that many, many listeners might be encountering?
Well, first of all, you can put my name on a poster that says that I'm a massive advocate of providing technology to schools. I think it's a deeply inequitable reality. I was very actually heartened to see how much tech landed in classrooms during COVID. It's a shame it took COVID for that to happen. But I'm, happy to hear that most of the school and district partners we have and the ones we're interacting are starting to actually have access to tech. If it's not one-to-one, it's a one-to-two relationship. So to start, the first thing I'd say is it's not right that we don't provide teachers and students with access to technology. The second thing I'd say is you don't actually need a device per student, which is just something to keep in mind. When I launched this model, I was in a school where there were, 3 floating carts per floor. I happened to be the cart captain, which is what I was called. So I was able to have the devices in my room most of the time. And I presented a rationale, by the way, to my principal. I said, hey, I have a really powerful way I think I can leverage this. So do you mind if I have the computers as much as possible? And it did. Because all we're doing is replacing lectures with 6 to 9 minute instructional videos, the bulk of the learning experience is still not happening on the computer. It's happening in the in-person setting. It's happening with kids interacting with each other. So you don't need a device for every kid because not every kid's watching the screen for most of the time, frankly. And a lot of teachers will leverage things like splitters so kids can watch videos together and things like that using their personal devices like phones. And then lastly, if you're really in a jam here where you don't actually have much access to technology, the purpose of technology in our classrooms, certainly tech has unbelievable power and leveraging Google Docs and Google Sheets and slides for really creative kind of outputs and presentations is awesome. But if you don't have that, what you're really leveraging the technology for at its bare minimum is the elimination of live lectures. To eliminate a live lecture, you don't have to create an instructional video. You can have some sort of piece of writing that kids have to review. There could be a demonstration that's happening in a station model. There could be an activity that kids kind of connect together for. So there's ways to kind of think about how you can replace live lectures and infuse self-pacing without having to actually build an instructional video. But the instructional video creation piece is usually the most effective.
For sure, for sure. And I think that all of the ideas that you just shared are proof positive that you are an educator at heart. I think educators could have a circle and find some way to fit it into a square peg. And it sounds like that's exactly what's happening. So I'm kind of curious. I know that you guys are reliant on teachers who are actually employing the model in their classrooms to share out best practices, to talk through some of the things that are working. Can you kind of share the story of a teacher or two that is innovating on the modern classrooms approach and the actual results that they've been able to achieve?
Yeah. The good thing is it's hard to isolate one just because we have so many of them. And just to contextualize scale for folks, I mentioned there's 28,000 teachers in the free course as of now. The way that we train teachers formally in our program, which usually comes through school and district partnerships, but also through scholarship programs, which I think we'll be able to share a little bit about a scholarship program that Screencastify is going to sponsor. But these are educators that then go through our mentorship program where they actually get paired with a real mentor and get to learn the model. And we've enrolled over 2,300 educators in that program since May of 2020. So there's a variety of access points where people learn about the model. Some of my favorite examples, I got to speak to a teacher in Belgium the other day who's using this model in her PE class. She has a giant kind of gym and kids come in and they have different kind of activities that they have to do. And there's a cool pacing tracker and they watch instructional videos on their iPad and the mastery checks come in very different forms. So instead of using a traditional mastery check or assessment that might be somebody solving an equation or writing a thesis statement, these kids might actually do physical activity and really recreate something with their bodies, maybe learn how to dribble a basketball. So that's one really cool example, and those are elementary kids. One of our mentors teaches a class that is to make musical beats in Spanish, and the final output of each unit is an actual musical beat. So they travel through the unit in a self-paced setting with the pacing tracker. They watch instructional videos on how to actually use the program effectively, like how do you create the beats. Each mastery check is a different component of their final song, and then the final song is the final output. So, those are just some small examples of what we see across the country and the world, frankly, of really powerful implementation. And then you have really crazy, cool district-wide and school-wide expansion. We have a district out in Concord Community Schools In Michigan, that's rolled out this model with over 60% of their educators. They're seeing massive test score gains in the K-8 level, particularly in math assessments. We have a district out in Minnesota where 175 of their teachers are traveling through the program and experimenting. You're seeing levels of implementation, kindergarten, all the way up to 12th grade. So you see this kind of stuff throughout the country. And a lot of time it's super organic, which I love, right? It's just a teacher who finds the model, implements, loves it, and then shares it with their peers. And that's how I believe change is actually scaled in education. It's usually through word of mouth. It's usually from one teacher sharing something awesome with another teacher.
Oh, absolutely. I believe there is a fairly famous quote that says that teachers are really, really gifted at the art of stealing. Although I would not call it stealing, and I think that it really is very powerful innovation where you find something that's working in one classroom and then you mold it to fit the classroom and the students that you are a part of. And on that subject of innovation, how is Modern Classrooms Project going to change in the next few months, in the next few years? What have you guys learned, and how is that changing the way in which you mentor and coach teachers?
Yeah, I mean, so we've changed a lot since we originated. I mean, this organization was founded back in 2017, 2018. And it was me and my co-founder in a room with 8 other teachers training them in person. And now we have a virtual mentorship program with 80 plus mentors across the world, training right now as we speak over 1,000 educators across the world through the virtual space. So I think we're constantly trying to innovate from the professional development standpoint. Our belief is that professional development needs to be relevant, it needs to be actionable, and needs to use people's time effectively. We hate the idea of just like professional development that's rooted in theory and buzzwords with no action. So when you travel through our program, like you build an actual modern classrooms unit that you use, and you have one mentor to go back and forth with, to discuss, to get feedback from. So we do a lot of innovation on that front to just make sure that people feel like they can learn our model in a digestible way and an easy way. And then also making sure that our free resources are always available all the time and we don't hold information back. I think there's going to be a lot of innovation because we rely on our teaching base to drive the quality of our work. So the bigger the movement, the more resources, right? Like every year you should check out our website and see our exemplar units, and that list gets longer and longer. So one day we have an IB physics class that you can see on our website, and one day you'll have a music class in Belgium that kind of shows how they do it out there. So the more people that do our model, the more resources we have to share publicly with the world. So essentially that innovation is just going to accelerate. The other thing we see, and our mentors talk about this all the time, is our mentors are learning from participants all the time. So they might see a new participant who submits a pacing tracker for how to track student progress in a classroom in a self-paced setting that they've never seen before. We ask that teacher, do you mind if we share this in our courses? And next thing you know, there's a new tool or resource that folks can use. So it applies both to new ways to leverage the model and customize the model, but also new guidance on different subjects, different grade levels, and all that good stuff. You know, the most popular way people have come in contact with our model is through the Edutopia video. There's an Edutopia video that was made about my classroom in a history classroom that's about 5 minutes, and it was a secondary video. So now in the fall of 2022, we'll be releasing an elementary video, right? So just elements like that to make the model more digestible and accessible to every single teacher across the country and the world is where I think we'll be doing most of our innovation.
Sure. And I think you just said 2 things that are going to make everyone smile. First, that there are free resources that are available all the time. I think teachers are both scrappy in being able to make things fit their classroom, but also in being able to find free resources to be able to stretch very minimal budgets. And you calling out sometimes that PD is not exactly relevant to what we need and want is going to get you a ton of friends here. So it sounds like you guys are doing great in terms of being able to make the model accessible to as many teachers as possible, and also making sure that it is relevant to as many classrooms as possible, which is absolutely awesome. So The other thing that I'm curious about is it sounds like this really is a professional learning community where folks are learning from mentors. They're learning a lot about the actual model, but they're also learning from each other. And as a result of that, the framework and MCP is continuously evolving. So, what does it look like to see some of the lessons that have been given by different teachers? Is that something that folks can take and use in their classrooms, or how can they really, really make the most out of this community learning approach that you guys have facilitated?
Yeah, I mean, one of the coolest places to go is just our Facebook group. There's a Facebook group, and it's not the page, it's our actual Facebook group. There's about 6,000 teachers in there right now, and they're just sharing ideas all day long. Questions pop up, people share ideas, thoughts, connections, all that good stuff. If you're part of any of our programming, that's like our Summer Institute or our virtual mentorship program, there's also a Slack channel with a similar environment and vibe to it. We stay away from curriculum creation. Like we don't have curriculum, we don't make curriculum, and part of the reason why is every single school community, every teacher is different, so there's not value in us prescribing that. But what we encourage is cross sharing, so folks actually creating communities where they can share resources. Now sometimes that happens across the country and the world. More often what it happens is it happens within a school community. Like some of our best implementers, we had a couple English teachers that I used to watch teach in the DC area all the time, where it was a group of 3. They all taught 6th grade English. They would rotate who built what video. They'd share those resources. They connect with each other, and they'd really create a streamlined methodology to planning and executing the model in a really beautiful way that still stayed true to the blended self-paced, mastery-based component. So we like to facilitate connections. We aren't necessarily the creators of all those resources, right? Instead, we want to be able to point people in the right direction so they have access to new materials.
Sure, sure. And what I love about what you just said is it also creates an approach that allows teachers to implement this model without necessarily needing to be the sole content creator. When we deliver professional development here at Screencastify, one of the biggest objections we have is, where am I going to find time to create all of these instructional videos? And of course, we could say that perhaps that's the wrong approach, and there are ways in which this actually saves teachers a significant amount of time. But nonetheless, being able to provide a community of educators who are working together to create content, amazing. So I love that story of kindergarten teachers who are working together to be able to promote mastery amongst all of their students. How often do you see that type of stuff happening in the schools and districts that you guys partner with?
Constantly. I mean, it's a question of economies of scale, really. I mean, sometimes we're partnering with a very small school where there's only one teacher who teaches geometry. Then they're kind of siloed, and the goal there is to make sure that they can find other geometry teachers across the country. But when we're talking about district scale, where hundreds of teachers within a district are learning the model, they're constantly collaborating with each other. I actually ran a little bit of an experiment myself, because when I was still a teacher, I taught probability and statistics one year, and I just put all of my slide decks that I built my videos on, my guided notes, my mastery checks, and my assignments on a USB. And I showed up at the probability and statistics district meeting, which was like 20 teachers, and I just handed everyone the USB. And I was like, this is my learning management system. These are my instructional videos. Feel free to make your own. Go. And found out shortly after that plenty of those educators just took those resources and started to replicate and emulate that. And we see this across the board, across districts and school communities all the time, as folks will do that. The biggest challenge is when a teacher's siloed, right? When they're the only person doing something. And that's just a tough situation to be in. And that's when they can lean on our community to just have folks to connect with and chat with.
For sure, for sure. So when all else fails, show up at your district meeting with a USB drive, and you too could start a movement. So that's the way. I myself might show up with a CD-ROM. Do you think that'll work too?
Maybe. It depends on what device you have. I don't think Chromebooks can actually take those anymore, but I would take it.
All right, we are at our favorite segment where we ask each of our heroes to share a tip for teachers. So Kareem, I'll ask you first. What is your tip for teachers who are coming into the 2021-2022 school year after a pretty crazy 2020-2021 school year?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is don't be too reactive to, I think, what's frankly been in the media. This kind of panic around learning loss, panic around kids needing to catch up. The number one thing kids need is connectivity and relationship building. And it's actually one of the biggest reasons I advocate for this model, because the way you build relationships is you step away from the front of the room and you engage in one-on-one and small group conversations where you actually learn about kids. You take notes about who they are and what they're going to be, what they want to do, what their aspirations are, and you come back to that and revisit that. So the biggest piece of advice I have for any educator is to think about ways that you can maximize the small group and individualized instruction that you can have with your students. Those small, intimate engagements that allow you to actually get to know kids better and make them feel comfortable and safe. Now, our model presents one way to do that, but there are plenty others out there. But that's the number one focus, I'd say. So don't feel rushed and don't feel panicked by the challenges of feeling like you have to get through content really fast. Focus on what matters most, which is building relationships with kids.
I love it. I love it. And since you are the instructional video guy, according to me, which maybe means nothing, what might you tell teachers who want to build relationships and also want to utilize instructional video? Is there a way to use instructional videos to build relationships?
Yeah, I mean, the real way to use instructional videos to build relationships is to eliminate you having to do live lectures at the front of the room, so you're free to actually interact with kids. And I think that's the coolest part of any models that actually leverage instructional videos. So when you think about instructional videos, make sure that they're actually increasing your capacity. Right? If you're spending all your time at home building instructional videos and then you're still going into the classroom and doing some sort of live performance at the front of the room, you're wasting your time and like you're driving yourself insane. So make sure that you're leveraging the videos so that it frees you up. If it's not freeing you up, if it's not leading to more communication and connectivity, it's not actually serving its purpose. So the best piece of advice I'd say there is make sure that when you build a video, it's actually designed to release your capacity so that you're able to do the most powerful elements of the learning experience, those differentiated small group and individualized instruction communities.
Sure. And I'm going to ask you for one more tip. I'm getting greedy here, but it sounds like there really is a difference between effective instructional videos that free you up as a teacher and give you the capacity to build relationships, push kids, and all of that good stuff, and instructional videos that fall flat. So if you could give teachers a few tips or things to look for in order to make sure that an instructional video is actually effective, what would those things be?
I mean, the first is length, right? We have to understand that we have been conditioned as educators to think that I need to deliver a lesson that fills up the entirety of a class period. And that is made up off of no research. There's no rationale behind an 80-minute versus a 60-minute versus a 45-minute instructional period. So you don't need to build a video that covers like all that work time. Instead, focus on making sure that each video covers one isolated skill and that it's under 9 minutes, ideally around 6 minutes. The other piece of advice I give all the time to folks is make sure that something's happening on the screen while you're talking. The most disengaging videos I ever watch are ones where there's just a bunch of words on a screen. You're talking, nothing's moving. There's no animations, there's no annotations, right? It's just like words on a page and someone talking. I can almost guarantee you that the kid is staring right out the window, not hearing or listening to anything. And then finally, couple instructional videos with some tool that's going to keep them engaged. My favorite is guided notes. Right? Kids should leave the video with something because that's evidence that they were engaged in listening, but it's also a way for them to go back and actually track what they learned. So those are the three biggest pieces of advice I'd give folks.
All right. I love it. I love it. So we can sum that up. And this is Nef talking, not the Modern Classrooms Project talking, to really good videos aren't boring, right? They don't bore us for a long period of time. They have something going on screen, whether that's a screen recording or dope annotations. And they also give kids something to physically do or a tangible product. I absolutely love it. So if listeners are hooked like me and they want to get started with the Modern Classrooms Project, what should they do next?
I mean, without a doubt, obviously visit our website at www.modernclassrooms.org. But really, the best place to go is our free course. Like we're a nonprofit. We really don't hide information from people. So if you just go to learn.modernclassrooms.org, that's our free course. Make an account, explore our resources. You can spend 20 hours in there or 30 minutes in there, but it's the single most powerful way to learn our model. And then if you're really inspired and interested, the virtual mentorship program is the next step. And that usually comes with a school partnership or a district partnership. But just start the free course. Learn, experiment, check it out. And you can obviously go to our social media channels. They're all at Modern Class Proj. We have Instagram, Twitter, the Facebook group. all that good stuff. But the free course is the place to go.
Awesome. Kareem, I really appreciate you joining our inaugural episode. I can't think of a better guest to kick us off. And we have to thank you for sharing more about the Modern Classrooms project. Teachers, listeners, be sure to visit modernclassrooms.org for more information and resources about the Modern Classrooms project. You heard it from Kareem. It's free. There is literally nothing to lose. And we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Nef.
Thank you for listening to this episode of EdTech Heroes, presented by Screencastify.